Hey y'all, and welcome back to Chapter 6. So in Chapter 6, I'm going to go ahead and read the discussion questions to you that are in your Google Classroom for you to answer as soon as we get done reading. The first question says, what emotion does Charlotte feel when she first sees Mr. Millshark again? Give evidence to support. So remember, when a question says to give evidence to support that means that we want you to give an example of something from the text that shows where you got your answer. All right, the second question says, what character trait does Mr. Millshark display on the ride? Give evidence from the text to support. Remember, character traits describe the way that the person acts. So think of maybe he's mean, or maybe he's friendly, maybe he's conniving or suspicious, or, any word to describe the way the person is. And then the final question for the day says, what gift does Charlotte have for Vern? How did she get it? All right, guys, so here we go, Chapter 6. What cheer stables in Providence, Rhode Island, teemed with activity? There were plenty of passengers to carry, as well as parcels of mail and strong boxes from the bank. Charlotte settled into a busy routine caring for her horses and her passengers. She was partial to the women and children, always respectful and giving them the best seats. The occasional grumbling men didn't complain too much because the talk was that they were riding with the best and the safest driver on the whole Atlantic coast. Charlotte didn't have much time for cause to worry until one morning when Ebenezer handed her a manifest with a list of passengers. She froze at the name before her. It couldn't be the same Mr. Millshark, could it? Carefully, Charlotte peeked from under her hat and studied the group of people standing in the ticket office. There was a group of women and 2 children and 1 gentleman. The gentleman was Mr. Millshark. One and the same, dressed in a handsome gray suit, but something was peculiar about him. Had he grown taller? Much taller. Then Charlotte noticed the fancy boots with high heels that made him actually look taller than he was. Suddenly, Charlotte felt 12 years old again, and she knew that she'd never have to go back to the orphanage, but her heart told her that there was more at stake. If he discovered her, he'd make sure that people knew who she was and what she had done. Once word got out, it wouldn't matter how old she was or how good of a driver she was. Customers would not ride with a woman. When Ebenezer saw Charlotte standing still, he said, "Charlie, get to work." "I'll get the rear boot," said Charlotte, and she began loading the baggage and the leather storage bit behind the coach. She tied the overflow baggage on the roof of the carriage, double and triple checking the knots. She felt jittery and her forehead broke out in beads of sweat. She took out her kerchief and dabbed her brow. Ebenezer handed her the paperwork. "You look like you seen a ghost," he said. "I don't think I can drive today." "What are you blabbing her about? The mail's got to go through, same as the passengers." Then Ebenezer looked over at Mr. Millshark, and he studied the man, and after a while a feeling of recognition settled over him. Could it really be the same man from the orphanage who had come looking for a runaway girl years ago? Ebenezer put his hand on Charlotte's shoulder. "Now listen, don't you pay attention to them passengers, no mind. You are what you are. And what you are is a fine horseman and the best coachman I ever saw. You remember that. Under the circumstances, there ain't nothing left for you to do but get your job done. So get it done. So get to it." Charlotte looked square at Ebenezer. Ebenezer looked square back at Charlotte and said, "You're the coachman. You're in charge. So load 'em up." Charlotte pulled her hat down lower over her face and she tied the kerchief over her nose. She hoped Ebenezer was right. "All aboard!" she yelled. Charlotte seated the women first and put them by the windows. Those were the best seats. Then she put in the children. "Do you have a seat for me, good man?" said Mr. Millshark. You can squeeze in the middle bench with them children," said Charlotte. "Could I persuade you with a few fine cigars to let me sit up top since I'm going to the next town?" he asked. Charlotte hesitated. She didn't want to urge Mr. Millshark any more than she had to. She didn't want to argue with Mr. Millshark any more than she had to. and any reputable stage driver would never turn down a handful of cigars. Certainly, she said stiffly, and climbed into the box seat, keeping her head turned away. Pleased with himself, Mr. Milshark climbed up next and sat next to Charlotte. Thank you, he said. It'll be a pleasurable ride for sure. 2 stock tenders brought the leaders' horses out, positioned them on the traces, and handed the ribbons to Charlotte. Next came the swings, the middle horses in the lineup, and last came the wheelers, the horses closest to the wheels. The stock tenders released the leaders. Get along, my beauties, yelled Charlotte. With the flick of her wrist, the stagecoach lurched forward, and Charlotte carefully maneuvered the stage out of town. She allowed the horses to pick up speed. The coach began rocking across the countryside, veering down a dusty road. Through braces, 3-inch straps of leather hooked to the axles cradled the carriage like a baby in a hammock. The coach rocked back and forth, and the passengers on the inside bounced on the padded seats, but up top, where Charlotte and Mr. Milshark sat, there was nothing but a wooden bench. Mr. Milshark wedged into the corner of the box seat and held on to his hat with one hand and clutched a narrow rail with the other. Charlotte knew every twist in the road, and she knew when she could speed up and when she should hold back. She remembered Ebenezer's words, "You are a fine horseman and the best coachman I ever saw." "Going a little fast, aren't you?" yelled Mr. Milshark. "I know my horses by heart, and I'm not one for bad driving, so hold on tight," hollered Charlotte. Nervously, he said, "You're the boss." "Giddy up," she yelled, giving the horses more rein and enjoying this moment of power over Mr. Milshark. She loved the thrill of being in the master team. Charlotte looked at him. He seemed pitiful, hanging on to the rails for dear life. Why, she wasn't even going fast. She knew which roads might be flooded after the rain, and which might be cluttered with branches after a storm, and which were muddy. A few days earlier on the same road she got stuck in a mud bog near Jensen's farm. Today she would have to go around it by another road to miss the bog, but suddenly she felt kind of a childish urge for revenge and had an idea. She gave the team a loud whistle and drove them directly towards the middle of the bog. The stagecoach mirrored in the doughy mud, but Charlotte wasn't worried. The passengers weren't in any danger, and she still would get them to their spots in time. "Well, if that don't beat 'em all," said Charlotte. "We're stuck," said Mr. Milshark. "Let's get her out. You get some brush under the wheel so I can guide her on the other side," said Charlotte. "I beg your pardon," said Mr. Milshark. "I'm the only one who can drive this team, and them women in the coach are only good for cooking and sewing. I need a strong man to help me, or else we might be here until this mud dries, and I recommend taking off those fancy boots and them fine stockings, though." Mr. Milshark reluctantly peeled them off and got down from the coach. He sank in the mud up to his ankles. He picked up his feet slowly, sinking further in the mud with each step. He dragged some tree branches over and placed them under the wheels of the stagecoach. Inside the coach was cozy, paneled with brass wood and lit with oil lanterns with brass fittings. The small windows had leather shades that could be pulled down to protect the passengers from the weather or the dust. "Pull down those window shades, ladies," Charlotte yelled. "Don't want you to get muddy." Trying not to chuckle, Charlotte stayed up in the box seat and worked those horses back and forth, and each time the wheels turned, Mr. Milshark got sprayed with mud. Finally, Charlotte maneuvered the stage out of the bog and waited farther up the road than she needed to for Mr. Milshark to catch up. "Good man," said Charlie. "Thank you." Mr. Milshark climbed up top, but he didn't say a word. On the way to the next town, Charlotte drove as fast as was safe. When she glanced at Milshark, he looked as pale as milk. It was hours later when Charlotte stopped the stage. "Well, here we are, first stop," she said. "My boots?" said Mr. Milshark. Charlotte looked around. "They were here, I'm sure as I'm here," said Charlotte. "They must have dropped out of the way. Well, that's a pity. Well, I suppose we could go back and look for them." "No," said Mr. Milshark. No need." He held out a coin and said, "If you see those boots again, I would sure appreciate you retrieving them. They were specially ordered, very expensive. Yes, sir, said Charlotte. She took a coin and hopped down from the seat. She pulled off the kerchief from her face and busied herself with the baggage. Mr. Milshark was covered with a dry crust of mud and still complaining about his sore bottom and his lost boots. He climbed down and came over to Charlotte. Charlotte looked at him, nodded, and handed him his bags. A glimmer of recognition crossed Mr. Milshark's face. You look familiar, he said. Oh, that's what a lot of folks say, said Charlotte, as she hopped back in the box seat and readied the horses before she could respond. Mr. Milshark had a puzzled look on his face as he walked barefooted into the hotel. And hidden in the leather storage were a new pair of boots for Ebenezer. Y'all, that means that she took the boots. She plans on giving them as a gift. And that was the end of chapter 6. We are on chapter 7 now. And so tomorrow, Friday, is your makeup day. So if you got behind it all, make sure you get caught up on all your work. And then after your work is done for the week, you get to have Flex Friday. So ask your teachers a little bit about what Flex Friday is. Make sure that you have checked in and asked your teachers if you're missing any work this week. I know for 4th grade, we have decided to kind of slow down the work a little bit and make sure that you guys are able to get caught up and stay on track. And we had a really great discussion this week that this is literally the best week of work that you guys have given to us. So great job with that. Thank you so much for tuning in with me. I really, really love this time that I get to spend with you reading. So I will talk to you guys soon. Make sure you reach out to your teachers today, guys. We miss you so much. So we'll talk soon, and I will see you on Monday where we're going to read chapter 7 and 8. Bye, y'all.